It wasn't supposed to feel this lonely. That was the first thought that really stuck with me as I hiked up the narrow switchbacks, my breath coming out in quick puffs of white against the crisp mountain air. I had wanted this. No distractions, no schedule, just me and the trail for a few days. A solo trip to reset my mind after the mess of the last few months. After the investigation went cold, I hadn't told anyone where I was going, not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't want the questions. Pity, the reminders. I just needed to be alone, to clear my head, to stop replaying the same unanswered questions over and over again. And yet, something about the silence didn't sit right. The forest was alive with details, the crunch of pine needles underfoot, the faint creak of branches swaying in the breeze, the occasional distant rustle of unseen animals. But it all felt muted, like the forest was holding its breath. I had started early that morning, following the route I'd planned, a 3-day loop through one of the more remote sections of the range. It wasn't a well-worn tourist trail. It was the kind of place you had to research, prepare for. That was part of the appeal. I hadn't seen another person since I left my car at the trailhead. No other hikers, no wildlife even. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional snap of twigs beneath my boots. But sometime in the afternoon, as the sun started tilting lower in the sky, I felt it. That itch at the back of my neck, the sense that I wasn't alone. At first, I brushed it off. Just paranoia, I told myself. It happens when you're out here alone. The brain craves company and fills in the gaps. But the feeling didn't go away. I stopped to take a drink from my bottle, the cool water soothing my dry throat. That's when I saw them. Footprints, pressed lightly into the damp earth near the edge of the trail. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were fresh. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. The size was strange, too large for a child, too narrow for most men. But it was the depth that really got to me. They were deep, like whoever made them was impossibly heavy. I crouched down and placed my own hand next to one, just to measure. Then, with a creeping sense of unease, I tried to match the stride length. I couldn't. The steps were too far apart, like whoever made them was moving unnaturally fast. Not running, just covering more distance than should be possible. And then I noticed something else. The footprints didn't just lead forward. Some of them veered off the trail, climbing up the sides of trees. Others stopped abruptly, as if the person had vanished mid-step. I checked the forest, my pulse picking up. The trees were dense, the undergrowth thick. No way someone had sprinted barefoot through here without leaving more signs. A chill worked its way up my spine. I didn't linger, just shouldered my pack and kept walking, my pace a little faster now. By the time I reached my planned campsite, the sun was setting. A small clearing near a ridge, overlooking the valley below. Beautiful, but I wasn't in the mood to appreciate it. I set up my tent, made a fire, and tried to shake the unease. The forest felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel watched. And then, just as the fire started dying down, I heard it. A breath. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. I froze, my ears straining. It came again, closer this time. A slow inhale, followed by a long, deliberate exhale. I whipped my head around, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just shadows, and the faint glow of the firelight. I told myself it was the wind, even though I knew better. That night in the tent was the longest of my life. I lay there, staring at the fabric above me, every muscle in my body tense. The forest outside was alive with sounds now, branches creaking, leaves rustling, the occasional snap of a twig. But it was the breathing that kept me frozen. It came in waves, faint and distant at first, then closer, like it was circling the tent. Sometimes it stopped entirely, leaving me in suffocating silence, only to start again, louder than before. I clutched the flashlight in my hand, my knuckles white. My heart pounded so hard, I was sure it would give me away. Every time I thought about unzipping the tent to look, my body refused to move. At some point, I must have drifted into a restless half-sleep, because I woke with a start to the sound of something brushing against the tent. A soft, deliberate scrape, like fingers trailing along the fabric. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. The sunlight filtering through the trees felt warm, reassuring. I told myself the breathing had been the wind, the scraping just a branch. I even laughed a little as I packed up camp, shaking my head at my own paranoia. But my hands were still shaking. I started down the trail, eager to put distance between myself and the clearing. But as I walked, something felt off. The path was unfamiliar. At first, I thought I had just taken a wrong turn, but I checked my map, my GPS, and I was right where I should be. And yet, the trees were different. The ridges didn't line up with what I remembered from the hike in. Even the light filtering through the canopy felt wrong, like the sun wasn't where it should be. The shadows fell in impossible directions, stretching toward the sun instead of away from it. The trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, their trunks bending and twisting like they were breathing. The ground beneath my boots felt unstable, subtly shifting, like it was alive. And then I saw them. The footprints, bare, deep, leading forward, on the exact path I was walking. My stomach dropped. They hadn't been there before. I turned sharply, scanning the woods behind me. Empty. The trail I'd just walked stretched behind me, undisturbed. But ahead, the footprints continued, leading me somewhere. A snapping branch to my right. I spun, breath caught in my throat. And there he was. Closer now. No trees to distort his shape. His proportions were wrong. His arms were too long, his legs too thin, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, if they were eyes, were too dark, too deep, like looking into empty sockets. I saw the way his head tilted, just slightly, like he was waiting. The wind picked up suddenly, rushing through the trees, carrying a sound with it. Not a whisper, not a word. A breath. Close. Right behind me.
The boat's engine sputtered, coughed, and then died with a final, pitiful gasp. My stomach dropped. I froze, gripping the edge of the seat, my knuckles white. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like a weight pressing against my eardrums. My throat tightened, and I struggled to swallow. I turned the key again, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. The engine clicked, coughed, and then fell silent again. "Come on," I whispered, my voice cracking. I tried again. Nothing. The absence of sound felt physical, like the world had been muted. Even the water lapping against the hull seemed too soft, too distant. My own breathing was loud in my ears, ragged and uneven. I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the horizon. Nothing but open water. No boats, no planes, no sign of anyone. I was alone. I grabbed the oar and started rowing, the muscles in my arms burning as I pushed the boat toward the rocky shore. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow, pressing down on my chest like a weight. When the boat scraped against the rocks, I jumped out, my boots slipping on the wet surface. The air smelled like salt and seaweed, but there was something else beneath it, a faint, sour odor, like something rotting. I grabbed my bag and climbed up the shore, my heart still racing. The island was quiet, too quiet. The campsite was easy enough to find, a small clearing near the center of the island, surrounded by trees. It looked like someone had been here before. There was an old fire pit, half buried in dirt, and a few rusted cans scattered around. I dropped my bag and started unpacking. Tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, food. Everything I'd need to stay here for a few days, maybe a week. Long enough for things to blow over. I didn't want to think about what would happen if they didn't. As I set up the tent, I noticed something strange. The ground beneath the clearing wasn't solid dirt, it was stone. Smooth, flat stone like a floor. I crouched down, brushing away the leaves and dirt. The stone was dark and weathered, with faint markings carved into its surface. Symbols. They weren't random. They were angular, sharp, almost jagged, like they'd been carved with something crude. But when I tried to focus on them, they seemed to shift, as if they didn't want to be looked at directly. The longer I stared, the more my eyes watered. And when I glanced away, I could have sworn they moved, just slightly, just enough to make my stomach churn. I reached out, my fingertips brushing the edge of one of the symbols. A sharp, icy pain shot up my arm, like pins and needles mixed with frostbite. I yanked my hand back, gasping. The air around me grew colder, and I noticed frost forming along the edges of the stone, creeping outward like veins. I stumbled back, my breath visible in the freezing air. That night, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and carrying the sound of waves crashing against the rocks. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying not to think about the symbols. But I couldn't stop. Why would someone carve symbols into the ground, and why here, on this island? I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here to solve mysteries. I was here to stay hidden. But as the fire burned lower, I started to notice things. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches casting long, twisted shadows. The wind carried strange sounds, whispers almost, just at the edge of hearing. And the ground beneath me felt wrong. It was colder than it should have been, even with the fire. I tried to ignore it, but when I crawled into the tent, I couldn't sleep. The whispers didn't stop. The next morning, I decided to explore the island. I told myself it was just to pass the time, but the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols. The trees were dense, their branches tangled together like a web. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. I followed a narrow path that wound through the trees, leading toward the island's center. That's when I saw it, a shadow. It flickered between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. I froze, my heart pounding. It didn't move like an animal. It was too tall, too thin. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, and kept walking, but the air felt heavier now, and the faint smell of rot was back. The doorway was carved into the side of a rocky hill, almost hidden by vines and moss. The edges were rough, but the opening was perfectly square, like it had been cut with precision. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The doorway led into darkness. The air around it was colder, heavier, and the ground beneath my feet felt like ice. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave it alone, but I couldn't. The symbols on the ground at the campsite, the strange whispers in the wind, the feeling of being watched. It all led here. I stepped inside. The air inside the tunnel was damp and stale, carrying the faint smell of rot. The walls were rough stone, slick with moisture, and the floor sloped downward, leading deeper into the hill. My flashlight beam flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The deeper I went, the colder it got. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and I stopped in my tracks. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols like the ones I'd seen at the campsite, but larger, more intricate. They spiraled across the stone, overlapping and twisting together like a web. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, its surface stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. The stain looked fresh, the edges glistening in the dim light, even though the altar itself was ancient. And on the altar was a small, rusted object, a key. The key seemed to draw my eye, its surface faintly glinting in the dim light. I didn't want to touch it. Every part of me screamed to leave it alone, to turn around and get out of there. But something about the key pulled at me. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal. The moment I touched it, the whispers started again, but this time they weren't coming from the wind. They were coming from the walls. The whispers grew louder, rising and falling in chaotic waves. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were voices. You shouldn't be here. Bring it back. It hungers still. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift, their edges blurring and twisting, and the air grew colder with every passing second. My breath came out in short, visible bursts, and my fingers ached from the cold. The key in my hand felt wrong. It wasn't just cold, it was vibrating faintly, like a heartbeat. I stumbled back, clutching the key, my flashlight flickering wildly. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows at the edge of the chamber. It was tall and thin, its body unnaturally elongated, its proportions wrong. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its legs seemed to bend in ways they shouldn't. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching me. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest, and the smell of wet rot filled my nose. I turned and ran. The tunnel seemed longer on the way out, the walls closing in around me. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step, and I could feel the figure behind me, its presence pressing against my back. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and the cold bit into my skin, numbing my fingers and toes. When I finally burst out into the sunlight, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The island was silent again, but the silence felt wrong. I looked down at the key in my hand. It was heavier than it should have been, the metal cold enough to burn. I wanted to throw it away, to leave it behind, but I couldn't. Something told me I'd need it. That night, the whispers came back. They were louder now, clearer. And they weren't just whispers anymore. They were fragments of conversations, bits of words that almost made sense but didn't quite. Why did you take it? Bring it back. It belongs to us. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the clearing. The air was freezing, and the ground beneath the tent felt like ice. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the clearing. The whispers stopped. The fire pit was cold, the embers dead, and the symbols on the ground were glowing. The footsteps started again. Wet, heavy footsteps, squelching against the ground. They circled the tent, slow and deliberate, pausing every few steps. I held my breath, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the tent, and then the zipper started to move. Tooth by tooth, it slid downward, the sound sharp and deliberate in the silence. The fabric of the tent shifted, bulging inward, as if something was pressing against it. The smell of wet rot filled the air, so strong it made my stomach churn. I couldn't move, My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The zipper stopped halfway, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then a hand reached inside. It was pale and thin, the skin stretched tight over the bones, and it was dripping with water. The fingernails were blackened, cracked, and the water hissed when it hit the ground, tiny tendrils of steam rising into the air. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The hand withdrew, and the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent. The whispers returned, faint and distant. I didn't sleep. By morning, the whispers were gone, but the air was still freezing, and the ground beneath the tent felt like ice. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my bag. The key was still in my pocket, its weight dragging me down. I made my way back to the shore, my breath visible in the cold air. When I reached the water, I froze. The boat was gone. Panic set in. I ran up and down the shoreline, searching for any sign of it, but it was nowhere to be found. The water was calm, unnaturally so, and the horizon was empty. I told myself it had drifted away, that the tide had taken it, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The boat hadn't just disappeared. It had been taken. I don't know how long I wandered the island, searching for a way out. Hours, maybe days. The sun rose and set, but the light never seemed to reach the island. The trees cast long shadows that stretched across the ground, and the air grew colder with every passing moment. The whispers came and went, sometimes faint, sometimes deafening, and the figure started appearing more often. At first, it was just glimpses, a shadow in the trees, a reflection in the water. But then it got closer. I'd turn a corner and see it standing there, motionless, its face still hidden in darkness. It never moved, but I could feel it watching me. Eventually, I found myself back at the doorway. The key in my pocket seemed to pulse, growing colder with every step. I didn't want to go back inside, but I didn't have a choice. The whispers were louder now, echoing in my head, and the figure was closer than ever. I stepped into the tunnel, the key heavy in my hand. The chamber was the same as before, but the symbols on the walls were glowing faintly, their edges shifting and twisting. The altar was empty, and the figure was waiting for me. It stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. The figure reached out, its hand pale and dripping with water. "Bring it back," it said, its voice low and hollow. I held out the key, my hands shaking. The figure took it, its fingers brushing mine. The moment it touched the key, the whispers stopped. The chamber went dark, and the air grew still. When I opened my eyes, I was on the shore. The boat was back, bobbing gently in the water. The island was silent again, the doorway hidden behind the trees. I climbed into the boat, my hands shaking, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the island one last time. The figure was standing on the shore, watching me, and in its hand was the key.
Nate was already at the water's edge when I arrived, his back to me, shoulders hunched. He was holding something small in his hand, turning it over and over. The lake stretched out in front of him, dark and still, like a sheet of black glass. The air was heavy, damp and cold enough to bite at my skin. I stopped a few feet away, watching him. He didn't turn around. For a moment I thought about leaving, just turning around, getting back in my car and driving home. But then I saw what he was holding. Mom's necklace. The tiny silver locket caught the weak sunlight, glinting as it turned between his fingers. And then the lake rippled. It was subtle, just a faint shiver across the surface, but there was no wind. The water had been perfectly still a moment ago. "You kept that?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. Nate flinched, his shoulders stiffening. He slipped the necklace into his pocket and finally turned to face me. His face was thinner than I remembered, his eyes shadowed. He looked older, worn down. "She wanted me to have it," he said, his voice flat. I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. "Yeah, I know." He didn't say anything else, just turned and started walking toward the clearing where we'd set up camp as kids. The drive had been quiet. Too quiet. I kept reaching for the radio, my fingers brushing the dial, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it on. Mom had hated music in the car. She used to say it distracted from the view, even when the view was just endless stretches of highway. I glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see her there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but it was empty. The guilt sat heavy in my chest, the same way it always did when I thought about her, about the fight, about the things I'd said. I gripped the wheel tighter and kept driving. The clearing looked the same as it had when we were kids, the same towering pines, the same uneven ground, the same view of the lake through the trees, but it felt different now. The lake was too still. The air was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of insects. Just silence. Nate worked quickly, his movements sharp and precise, like he was trying to outrun something. I fumbled with the tent poles, my hands clumsy. "Here," he said, stepping in to help. His fingers brushed mine, and for a moment, I thought he might say something real, but he didn't. Instead, he pulled back, his jaw tight. "You always sucked at this." I forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. "Guess some things never change." He didn't laugh. As I hammered the last stake into the ground, something fluttered out of Nate's jacket pocket and landed in the dirt. "Hey, you dropped something," I said, reaching for it. Nate spun around, snatching it out of my hand before I could get a good look. "It's nothing," he said, shoving it back into his pocket. But I'd seen enough. It wasn't just a newspaper clipping, it was a stack of them, folded and worn. The edges were frayed, and I could see faint scribbles in the margins. Later, when Nate wasn't looking, I found one of the clippings near the fire pit. It must have fallen out of his pocket. The headline read, "Mother and 2 sons vanish at Whispering Lake." The photo beneath it showed a woman and 2 boys, smiling stiffly at the camera. Someone, Nate, I realized, had circled the boys' faces in red ink. In the margins he'd written, "The lake takes families." Why? I stared at the clipping, my stomach twisting. "Nate," I said, holding it up. "What is this?" He snatched it out of my hand, his face pale. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing," I said, my voice rising. "You've been researching this place, haven't you? For how long?" He didn't answer. That night, the lake felt closer than it should have. The air was still, heavy, and the water's surface rippled faintly, though there was no wind. We sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across Nate's face. He was holding the necklace again, his thumb brushing over the locket. And then I heard it. A voice, soft, faint, coming from the direction of the lake. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. "Why didn't you come?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was Mom's voice. Nate, I whispered, but he was already staring at the lake, his face pale. The voice came again, louder this time. I needed you. My chest tightened. Those were the last words she'd said to me before the fight. The cabin was farther up the hill than I expected, hidden among the trees. When we finally reached it, I stopped in my tracks. It was small and weathered, the wood dark with age. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Nate didn't hesitate. He walked right up to the door and pushed it open. Nate, don't... I started, but he was already inside. I followed him, my heart pounding. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been, and it smelled like damp wood and decay. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I stepped inside. The cabin was empty, but it didn't feel that way. There was a table in the center of the room, covered in dust, and a single chair tipped over on its side. On the far wall, there was a fireplace, the bricks blackened with soot. Nate was standing in front of the fireplace, staring at something carved into the wood above it. What is it? I asked, stepping closer. He didn't answer. I followed his gaze and saw the words scratched into the wood. The lake takes what it's owed. The whispers started as we were leaving. At first, they were faint, barely more than a rustle of leaves in the wind. But as we stepped outside, they grew louder, sharper. And then I heard it. My name. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Nate, I whispered, but he was already moving, pulling me down the hill. The whispers followed us, growing louder with every step. They weren't just voices. They were familiar. They sounded like Mom. We reached the campsite, but the whispers didn't stop. They circled us, coming from the trees, the water, the air itself. And then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the lake, her hair long and dark, her dress tattered and clinging to her body. Nate, I said, my voice trembling. He turned, his face pale. It's not her, he said, his voice tight. It's the lake. But I couldn't look away. She raised a hand, beckoning. A week later, Nate showed up at my door. I can't stop hearing them, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I let him in, and for the first time in years, we talked. Really talked. About Mom, about the fight, about everything we'd been too stubborn to say before. I'm sorry, I said, my voice breaking. For everything. Nate nodded, his eyes glassy. Me too. For a moment it felt like we'd finally found our way back to each other. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. I think the lake wants me to come back. I stared at him, my heart pounding. What are you talking about? He looked at me, his expression hollow. I think it's not done with me. And if I don't go back, it'll come for you instead. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was just his imagination, but deep down, I knew he was right. The lake takes what it's owed.
The trail disappeared 3 days ago. I don't know when it happened exactly. One moment I was following the markers, the next, nothing. Just trees, rocks, and the thin, biting air. I told myself I'd find my way back, but the mountain had other plans. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. It pressed against my ears, heavy and suffocating, like I'd been plunged underwater. Even my heartbeat felt muffled, as if the silence was pressing against my chest from the inside. It wasn't just sound that was missing. The silence was inside me. My thoughts felt slow, heavy like they were being smothered. Every time I tried to focus, it was like the silence was pressing against my mind, dulling the edges of my own consciousness. I clapped my hands once, hard, just to hear something. The sound was sharp, but it didn't echo. It just stopped. Like the air swallowed it whole, I shouted, and the noise barely made it past my lips before it was gone. My own voice sounded foreign, like it didn't belong to me. It was too high, too thin, like someone else was speaking through my throat. I stomped on the ground, and the crunch of leaves under my foot was there. Then gone, the sound dying before I even lifted my heel. The compass was next. At first, it was just a little off. North wasn't quite where it should have been, but I figured it was the altitude messing with the needle. By the second day, it was worse. North shifted every time I checked, like the mountain was spinning beneath me. By the third day, the needle spun in lazy circles, as if it had given up entirely. And then it started pointing to things that weren't there. I'd hold it steady, and the needle would jerk toward a patch of trees or a rock or empty air. Once it pointed straight up, as if north was somewhere in the sky. And once, it pointed directly at my chest. I kept walking. What else could I do? By the time the sun started to dip behind the peaks, I knew I was in trouble. The air was colder up here, sharp and thin, and my legs ached from climbing. I found a small clearing and decided to set up camp for the night. The silence pressed against me as I worked, heavy and suffocating. I tried to hum a tune, but the sound felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. When the fire was lit, I sat close to it, staring into the flames. The warmth was comforting, but it didn't chase away the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation, the exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there, staring at the fabric above me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something. A faint rustling, like dry leaves being dragged across the ground. I unzipped the tent and looked out. Nothing. Just the trees, standing still and silent, their shadows stretching long and thin in the moonlight. I lay back down, but the sound came again. Closer this time. When I opened my eyes, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. It was too tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its edges shimmered, like heat rising off asphalt, and parts of it flickered, disappearing and reappearing in slightly different positions, as if reality couldn't decide where it belonged. Its shadow didn't match its movements. When the figure shifted, its shadow moved in the opposite direction, jerking and twisting like it was trying to escape. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. And then it moved. Not like a person. Its body stayed perfectly still while its limbs shifted, jerking and twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its arms bent backward, its legs folding like a broken marionette. I scrambled out of the tent, grabbing the nearest rock and hurling it. The figure vanished. I stood there shaking, the rock still clutched in my hand. The fire crackled softly behind me, the only sound in the clearing. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was a wreck. My body ached, my head throbbed, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I packed up camp quickly, desperate to leave the clearing behind. The hours blurred together as I walked. The trees all looked the same, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. The ground beneath me felt wrong, no matter which direction I went. It always felt like I was walking uphill, even when I was going down. I passed the same twisted tree 3 times, but from different angles simultaneously. My footprints in the mud led in impossible directions, some walking up tree trunks, others disappearing mid-step. The shadows moved the wrong way. They stretched toward the sun instead of away from it, or bent at sharp angles that didn't match the terrain. Once, I saw my own shadow split in 2, each half moving in a different direction. The sun hung in the same spot for hours, unmoving, casting long shadows that never shifted. Time felt slippery, like it was stretching and folding in on itself. My phone was no help. The clock showed impossible times. 25:61:00:00. Numbers that flickered and changed every time I looked at it. And then I saw her. She was standing on the trail ahead of me, her back to me, her long dark hair swaying gently in the breeze. "Hello?" My voice cracked, hoarse from disuse. She didn't respond. I took a step closer, and she turned. Her face, it wasn't right. Her features were blurred, like a smudged photograph, and her eyes were dark, empty voids. Her mouth twisted into a shape that wasn't quite a smile. She raised a hand, and her arm stretched impossibly long, her fingers multiplying as they moved, writhing like worms. She pointed to the trees. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. When I blinked, she was gone. Eventually, I found something. Not a cabin, but the remains of an old mining operation. The equipment was rusted and broken, but it didn't look like it belonged here. The shapes were wrong, gears that didn't connect to anything, pipes that twisted into loops, machines that worked backward, their parts spinning in reverse. Some of the machines were moving, processing something invisible, their gears grinding against nothing. The rust seemed to spread as I watched, creeping across the metal like a living thing. Inside the crumbling shack, I found the journal. The pages were filled with frantic, scrawled handwriting, the words barely legible. Most of it didn't make sense. Disjointed ramblings about shadows and whispers and the mountain's hunger. But one entry stood out. "The mountain keeps what it likes. First the echoes, then the shadows, then the pieces of you that make you whole. It saves the best parts for later." The door slammed shut behind me. I don't remember how I made it back. One moment I was in the shack, the next I was stumbling into the ranger station at the base of the mountain. They asked me what happened, where I'd been, how I'd survived. I couldn't answer. But something's wrong. I can't hear my mother's voice anymore, or the sound of my own laughter. The silence follows me everywhere now, heavy and suffocating. And sometimes, late at night, I find pine needles in my bed. And when I look in the mirror, my reflection moves a fraction of a second too late. And no matter where I go, I always feel like I'm walking uphill.